The countryside pulsated with vitality and splendour as the shooting party of local society's elite strutted and cackled across the lush grounds of the sprawling estate, their laughter echoing through the lush woodland. Amid this display of affluence and elegance, Miss Elizabeth Bennet, the spirited daughter of a modest country gentleman in distant Hertfordshire, found herself both entranced and somewhat out of place. Accompanied by her aunt and uncle, the Gardiners, she now found herself in a world where wealth and privilege held sway. Clad in a modest olive-green muslin gown, with a tan spencer and a bonnet tied by unassuming dark ribbons, Elizabeth's appearance was a striking contrast to the lavishness surrounding her. A pang of self-consciousness tugged at her heart, as she wished, not for the first time that day, that she had paid more heed to her attire. Her aunt, Mrs. Gardiner, an amiable and elegant woman, and a favourite of Elizabeth and her four sisters, noticed Elizabeth's discomfort and smiled reassuringly, taking her by the arm. "I've long heard of these shooting parties as being second to none," she said. "How fortunate that the timing of our trip to the north has allowed us to take part in the excitement." "It is nice to have such lofty connections," said Elizabeth, nodding and wondering what adventures lay ahead of them for the day. "It will be well worth the slight alterations to our travel plans." In speaking that way, Mrs. Gardiner was referring to their decision to forego visiting the lakes. Elizabeth said, "Indeed, what are rocks and mountains compared with rubbing shoulders with the upper echelons of local society?" Tearing her eyes from all the beauty that surrounded her, Elizabeth saw her uncle, Mr. Gardiner, heading her way, accompanied by a younger man. The latter was tall and well-built, with piercing dark eyes. Impeccably dressed, he had a chiselled jawline that caught the light just so. His manly gait was the very picture of assurance. She had to admit this was not her first time seeing him, having glimpsed the gentleman with his noble mien soon after her arrival. She had not been unimpressed by the view. It was impossible for her not to notice the way his broad shoulders filled out his jacket, or the way his tan breeches clung to his muscular thighs. Nor had she missed the way eager young ladies had whispered and pointed in admiration of him as he passed them by. When they were face to face, Mr. Gardiner, a sensible, gentlemanly man, said, "Ladies, allow me to introduce you to Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy of Pemberley in Derbyshire. Mr. Darcy, pray allow me to present my wife, Mrs. Madeline Gardiner." The younger man slightly bowed. "It is a pleasure to make your acquaintance," he said to the older woman, even though Elizabeth could swear his eyes were fixed on her. "Oh, the pleasure is all mine," said Mrs. Gardiner. "And this young lady is my niece, Miss Elizabeth Bennet," Mr. Gardiner said, motioning to Elizabeth. Clasping his hands behind his back, Mr. Darcy bowed again. "Miss Bennet?" "It is a pleasure to make your acquaintance, Mr. Darcy," Elizabeth said, curtsying. "Our esteemed hostess, Lady Cantrell, has paired the two of you, my dear Lizzie, as shooting partners, and I offered to make the introductions." A sudden warmth rose to her cheeks. Her aunt had forewarned her to expect the unexpected, owing to Lady Cantrell's predilection to upend conventions, but Elizabeth never imagined being partnered with what appeared to be one of the most sought-after gentlemen in the assemblage. What a stroke of luck to be the happy recipient of such a handsome gentleman's attention for the best part of the day. Now she really wished she had dressed with more than usual care that morning. Upon second thought, she considered that, judging by Mr. Darcy's air, he likely cared too much about his own appearance to be concerned with the appearance of others. The weather was pleasant, the company lively, and the spirits were high, as the group, equipped with gear, set off into the woods surrounding the estate. The air was filled with anticipation as Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy fell into step beside each other, while the Gardiners trailed a respectable distance behind. A tremor of pleasure ran through Elizabeth's body in anticipation. Surely such a handsome and alluring gentleman can only bring delight to one's spirit. "Do you often take part in such occasions as this, Mr. Darcy?" Elizabeth asked, glancing up at him with a small smile. "Yes, I enjoy the sport whenever I have the opportunity," he replied, his tone measured and polite. The couple talked casually, exchanging polite pleasantries about the weather and the beauty of the estate. But as they entered the forest, Mr. Darcy's demeanour changed. He became more serious, more focused, as if sizing up the woods, mentally mapping out the best spots for their purposes. "Have you handled a firearm before, Miss Bennet?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "I must confess, my shooting skills are not as sharp as they ought to be," Elizabeth admitted with a sheepish smile. "But I shall do my best not to embarrass you too abominably." His eyes sparkling with unspoken amusement, the corner of Mr. Darcy's mouth twitched upward. "It takes practice and patience to become an expert shooter, but with the right instruction, I have no doubt you will excel." Elizabeth felt a thrill run through her at his words. There was something about the way he spoke to her, the way he looked at her, that made her feel alive and excited. They descended into the woodland, accompanied by the sounds of leaves crunching underfoot and the distant echo of gunfire from nearby shooting parties. Elizabeth stole glances at Mr. Darcy whenever she could, admiring the way the sunlight caught in his dark hair. In the shadow of the woods, Elizabeth's heart quickened, her breath catching as she aligned her sights on the target ahead. Mr. Darcy stood behind her, his hands gently but firmly guiding her aim. Each adjustment of her posture sent a thrill through her. Even if she were the most accomplished markswoman in all the land, she would happily avail herself of such ministrations, secretly cherishing these brief moments of intimacy, innocent though they were, and with a stranger no less, among the whispering leaves and ancient trees. "Focus on your breathing," he said softly. "Take a deep breath, then exhale slowly, and remember to squeeze the trigger gently, not pull it." She tried to concentrate on the task at hand, but it was becoming increasingly difficult in the face of Mr. Darcy's proximity and his warm breath on her neck. She tried to push the thoughts from her mind and steadied her breathing. As she fired, she felt a sense of satisfaction when she successfully made her shot. "Well done, Miss Bennet. You have a natural talent for this," Mr. Darcy said, his voice low and encouraging. Alarmingly, a deafening crack split the air. It was too close. In an instant, Elizabeth found herself enveloped in a strong pair of arms, her body flushed against Mr. Darcy's as they tumbled onto the forest floor, Mr. Darcy's firm body shielding hers. For a moment, Elizabeth lay stunned beneath him, acutely aware of his hard chest pressed against her and his warm breath on her cheek. Their eyes locked, their faces a hair's breadth apart. Elizabeth's heart thundered wildly. Mr. Darcy leapt up to his knees with a sudden urgency, his face flushed with concern. "There was a stray bullet, Miss Bennet," he said, his voice edged with fear. "Are you unharmed?" he demanded, his eyes frantically scanning her body, searching for any signs of injury. Elizabeth nodded and was silent. Mr. Darcy's quick reflexes had saved her, and the gravity of the moment was not lost on her. After ensuring she was indeed unharmed, Mr. Darcy helped her to her feet, his hands clasping hers with an intensity that lingered a heartbeat too long. Their faces hovered closer than propriety generally allowed, eyes locked in a gaze that communicated more than words could express. The air seemed to crackle between them, tension and something more profound forged in a perilous moment. Elizabeth was too stunned to speak, still in shock at what had just happened. The danger averted, she could but feel a flutter in her chest. "Is it possible that this handsome stranger has stolen my heart in just a single moment?" "Thank you," Elizabeth finally managed to say, looking up at him with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. "You saved my life." His eyes crinkled at the corners, as a warm smile spread across his face. "It was nothing, merely instinct," he assured her, his voice imbued with a sincerity that went beyond mere courtesy. "I could not let anything happen to you, could I?" The words were simple, but the depth of his concern resonated in every syllable, leaving no doubt of his genuine care for her well-being. Elizabeth felt a warmth spread through her body at his words. "There is something about this man that makes me feel safe and protected, even in the midst of danger." Looking around, and noticing the absence of Elizabeth's relations, she surmised that they had somehow separated somewhere along the way. Mr. Darcy, out of lingering concern over her ordeal, insisted upon accompanying her back to the manor house. As they walked along in companionable silence, Elizabeth stole glances at him, trying to decipher his thoughts. There was an intensity in his gaze that made her want to know more about him, to unravel the mysterious connection she felt toward him. How can I resist being drawn to someone who risked his own life to save mine? Walking back to the manor house in silence, his nerves raw, alive with sensation after their ordeal in the woods, unexpected feelings enveloped Mr. Darcy. He could not help but steal furtive glances at his companion, Miss Bennet, and wonder what it was about the young woman that had ignited an unfamiliar spark deep inside him. He had grown accustomed to feeling a certain aloofness towards others. However, there was something about the gratitude shining through her questioning gaze that made it difficult for him to avert his eyes. He walked on in silence, struggling with these confounding sentiments. What is happening to me? Darcy wondered. Mr. Darcy, Elizabeth said softly, interrupting his musings. He looked at her, his eyes wide and filled with an unspoken longing, his breath catching in his throat as he searched for words that refused to come. She moved closer, her steps deliberate and charged with intention, until she was standing right in front of him. Her eyes were shining, ablaze with an emotion he could not name, but felt resonating within his very soul. "I want to thank you again," she murmured, her voice trembling with gratitude and something deeper, "for saving my life in the woods. I cannot fathom what might have become of me without you." His mouth fell open, yet words failed him, trapped in his throat as his eyes were drawn irresistibly to her lips, full and tantalizingly close. A heat, unlike anything he had known before, coursed through him, consuming his thoughts and igniting a desire he could neither understand nor suppress. The urge to lean in and kiss her was almost overpowering, a pull that went beyond mere physical attraction, beckoning him into unknown territory. It was a foolish notion, of course, yet he could not shake the desire building inside him. "Mr. Darcy?" Elizabeth said again, and this time he could hear the concern in her voice. "Are you all right? You look distracted." He endeavoured to drive away the ungentlemanly musings, vowing to keep them firmly in the recesses of his mind. Mr. Darcy cleared his throat uncomfortably before speaking. "Yes, I'm quite all right, just a bit shaken still from our experience in the woods." "I understand," she said, nodding sympathetically. "It was quite frightening, but you were very brave. I do not know if I could have done what you did." He felt the odd sensation through him again, this time with a hint of pride at her words. "I was merely doing my duty, Miss Bennet. As a gentleman, it is my job to protect those in my care." "And yet," she said, looking up at him with a smile that made his heart skip a beat, "you went beyond what was required of you in risking your own life. For that, I am eternally grateful." They stood there for a moment, the surrounding air charged with an unspoken tension. Mr. Darcy knew he should say or do something, anything, to break the bewitching spell that seemed to have fallen over him, but he found himself rooted to the spot, unable to tear his gaze away from her. A reprieve came in the form of the Gardiners, Elizabeth's relations, rushing up to them, their faces pale with anxiety and filled with concern for their niece's ordeal. Their eyes widened with shock and gratitude as they took in the sight of Elizabeth, safe and unharmed. "Mr. Darcy!" Mr. Gardiner exclaimed, out of breath and clutching his hat to his chest. "We cannot thank you enough for preventing harm to our dear Elizabeth. We've been distracted, waylaid by another group in the party, and lost sight of her. To think what might have happened had you not been there." Mrs. Gardiner, her eyes brimming with tears of relief, reached out to embrace Elizabeth, her voice trembling. "Oh, my dear child, we were beside ourselves with worry. Thank heavens you are safe." Mr. Darcy bowed slightly, his eyes never leaving Elizabeth's face. "It was my honour and duty to ensure Miss Bennet's safety. I'm glad I was there to assist." The Gardiners continued to heap praises and thanks upon Mr. Darcy, their gratitude palpable. The bond between them and their niece was evident, and the relief in their voices was matched only by their determination to keep her safe. "We shall take care of Elizabeth from this point," Mr. Gardiner assured Mr. Darcy, his voice firm. "But rest assured, sir, your actions today we shall not forget. You have our deepest gratitude." With those heartfelt words, the Gardiners led Elizabeth away, their arms protectively around her. But even as they departed, the intensity of the moment lingered, a connection forged between Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy that went beyond mere gratitude and circumstance. Even as the Gardiners led Elizabeth away, Mr. Darcy could not tear his eyes away from her. It was as though he was seeing her for the first time. She was not like any other woman he had ever met before, and he considered that if he were not careful, he would be the one in danger.